I am very lucky. I've worked very hard, but I've also met the right people, kept my mouth shut and my eyes and ears open, and managed to find the right opportunities at the right time. If you find a rigger that doesn't want to tell you how or why something works, I'd find another rigger. If I can articulate how I do that and I can teach somebody else, then it means I must know it reasonably well.
Welcome to the StageLync podcast, your access and connection to the live performing arts. In this podcast, you'll hear from some of the industry's most inspiring people from around the globe who create magic on stage and backstage. Our guests share their knowledge, passion, and the real stories of how a show comes together. We hope you enjoy this episode. And welcome to the StageLync podcast. My name is Anna Robb, and today we're talking with Tiny Good. Tiny is a seasoned professional in rigging, staging, automation and technical services with over 3 decades of experience. As the founder of Showtech Australia in 1985, Tiny has built a reputation for delivering exceptional service in events ranging from local productions to global spectacles. A licensed Australian rigger and electrician, Tiny holds numerous qualifications including ETCP Arena and Theatre Rigger, Australian Arena Rigger, a qualification he co-developed, rope technician, scaffolder, crane driver, aerial rigger. He's also a co-author and coordinator for the International Code of Practice for Entertainment Rigging, including its Chinese translation. Tiny's portfolio spans 2 Olympic Games, 3 Commonwealth Games, 41 carols by Candlelight, and extensive tours across Australia, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and North America. He's worked with organisations like Circus Oz, Cirque du Soleil, and NICA, providing rigging, production management, and training. From K-pop to corporate events, musical theatre and television, Tiny's expertise in rigging and automation has been integral to countless productions. His diverse skill set and dedication to safety and innovation makes him a leader in the live performance and event industry. Tiny, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Anna. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, so good to see you again. You know, the depth of your breadth of your resume is quite hard to match, I have to say. I think it's one of the the deepest portfolios. And I also know that, like, when anybody talks about automation in Australia, your name comes up. So I'd like to just maybe start with, because we have a global audience, a little bit about the landscape of work in Australia and what, you know, Showtech does in that landscape.
Sure. So Showtech started in we call it amateur theatre over here. So people that have got regular day jobs who get together and do musicals and dramas as a hobby. We started being the crew for them. You know, they'd been rehearsing Brigadoon and My Fair Lady and whatever for a couple of months, suddenly realised they're going into a theatre and they've got no crew, no stage management, etc. And we started to fill that gap. Next thing I know, we're running a company, then we've got crew and gear and a premises, and yeah, all of a sudden here we are 30-something years later, and we've done some of the biggest shows on the planet. I think to start with, I am very lucky. I've worked very hard, but I've also met the right people, kept my mouth shut and my eyes and ears open, and managed to find the right opportunities at the right time. I've also been very lucky that some of the things I've said yes to, I look back later and think, gee, I was, a bit of imposter syndrome. Was I really supposed to be doing that at that time? But it all worked out very well. So Showtech we're in an interesting position in Australia. One of the things that, as you mentioned, the rest of the world may not understand about the Australian landscape is that we do shows about the same scale as some of the other shows around the world, but we probably do it on less budget and less advance time, less planning time than a lot of people in the Northern Hemisphere are used to. For instance, we just did a very large China pop show in Australia with about 3.5 weeks notice. So, some of those shows, and we put it up in 4 days. It was a stadium show, lifts, a lot of moving trusses, a lot of moving parts, lighting rig, just over 1,100 lamps. They put it up in KL a couple of weeks before, and they had 12 days from load into the show, and we had 4. So
wow.
Yeah, we do. The other thing is some of our corporate events, we tend to do more of the production designers ask us what we've got on the shelf, and then they design a show around what we've got, rather than, Northern Hemisphere shows, they'll come to a supplier with 6 months notice and say, we really want to do this. Can you build us a special lift or reveal or something? In Australia, it's very much we buy things on the hope that the producers will use them, and most of the time we're right. Sometimes we're wrong, and it sits in the warehouse for 5 or 6 years, and then all of a sudden it becomes the flavour of the month. But yeah, we do. We're using a lot of software, things like AutoCAD, Vectorworks, etc. And I'm doing some work with Vectorworks at the moment about making that slightly faster and easier to use for what we call down and dirty shows. Vectorworks is a fantastic program, and you talk to people in the Northern Hemisphere and they say, yeah, I've been working on this drawing for 3 months. If I get 3 days to do a 200 hoist show, I'm doing really well. So, yeah, we're doing some work with them and AutoCAD too in Australia to try and make those programs a little bit faster and easier to use when you've just got to belt something out, get it into place. But obviously, we also have to make sure that we're right. So,
that's really interesting.
Just because it's down and dirty and you've got a small amount of time doesn't mean you can make assumptions, especially when shows come in around the 60 or 70 ton mark. We just recently did a video wall that was one lift, as in we built it and it all moved in one hit, and was 36 tons. 36 tons. So, fair bit of engineering went on in that. And once again, we put it together in a very short amount of time, but, it all worked out very well with a lot of people putting their input into it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think the reason perhaps for that speed, like you said, is one is budget, but also nothing in Australia is going to sit in a place for too long a period, right? Because there's not the demographic to run it for weeks and weeks on end. And when you're thinking about moving it from city to city, it's not a short drive. You're moving a lot of gear a very long way if you're going to move it from Sydney to Melbourne to Brisbane, right?
Yeah. Just to put it in context, it's about 1,000 kilometres, so about 700 miles from Melbourne to Sydney. So it's roughly a 12-hour truck journey to move a show. So the idea of moving overnight from one city to another, it's actually more like a 14, 16-hour exercise, not a 2 or 3 hour exercise. And I've done that drive in a truck many times.
I'm sure you have. I love that. And now tell us a little bit about one of the things that I think that is a little bit of, and because you understand and know rigging, like tell us about the rigging certifications in Australia, because rigging certifications around the world vary from place to place, to not needing some at all to needing certificates and tickets and stuff. So can you give us a little bit of a rundown of what's expected in Australia? And yeah.
Sure. We actually came into this situation recently with both Pink's tour and Taylor Swift's tour, where in Australia we have a group in each state called WorkSafe, and that's kind of like OSHA in America. Their inspectors suddenly got very interested about who was coming into our largest stadium in Australia, which is the MCG, Melbourne Cricket Ground, putting up this show and potentially doing rigging and forklifts and work platforms and that sort of thing without an Australian license. In Australia, you have to have an Australian license, which is something that's government issued. So you have to go and do training, do an assessment, and then you're issued a license by the state government. The licenses are then recognised by other states, but they are issued state by state. We also have a thing called construction induction training, which is like a 1 day. It's similar to OSHA 10 or the construction safety card that they do in the UK. But once again, it's issued by the state governments, and it's something that the state government takes very seriously. Is if you're a worker on what they call a construction site, which means working around cranes, forklifts, work platforms, assembling and dismantling structures, that's considered to be a construction site. For many years, the entertainment industry said, we're not a construction site. And then they lay out the guidelines. And well, right up until pretty much the first guitar walks on stage, we are a construction site. And even with some of the big festivals, if you've got forklifts, etc., loading trucks backstage. There's that delineation line between the performance area and the logistics area backstage. Rigging is, once again, it's a high-risk works license. So it's a license that's issued by the state government to a set of criteria, but it has nothing to do with the entertainment industry. So you then have to get your experience working with trusses and chain hoists and counterweight flying systems and all of that sort of thing, which brought me onto a very strange path. Many years ago, myself and a couple of other people were talking about the difference between the Australian riggers license and a proper entertainment license. I looked at what ESTA was doing in the States when they were first rolling out the ETCP arena and theatre riggers tickets, and went to a couple of conferences, spoke to Bill Sapsis and Laurie Rubenstein and others about, was there a possibility of bringing ETCP into Australia? Because of the way that it's chartered in America, that's not a possibility. So they said, we're happy to help you write something, but it needs to be Australian and it needs to comply with Australian regulations and Australian laws, and we can't just roll out the ETCP program. I had a conversation, same thing with Chris over in the UK about NCP, and that was the same story. All of a sudden, I'm talking to a bunch of people every couple of months and writing a thing called ICOPA, the International Code of Practice for Entertainment Rigging. Part of writing the riggers certificate for Australian entertainment rigging was actually understanding what that is, and all of a sudden, I'm helping to write that code of practice. Finished that, went and did the ETCP rigging certificate, which you can do online over in Australia. You have to do it through a recognised testing centre, but you can actually do the ETCP certification outside of the US. Did that as a bit of an example, and then partnered with the Arts Centre Melbourne training organisation and the Australian government skills framework, and wrote what's now known as the Australian Arena Rigging Certification. So we rolled out the first one of those in July this year. So there's now 10 people in Australia that have got that certification. There's about 120 that are waiting to do their testing.
Amazing. And what does that look like? Is it a test or a course, or what is that curriculum?
It's an assessment. So One of the things we had to do to comply with the Australian government regulations is you need to have an intermediate or advanced riggers ticket, as in the license from the government, and the construction induction training as a prerequisite to do the arena rigging. So we've ticked the box with complying with government regulations as the prerequisites, and you then get an assessment in things like chain hoists and rigging procedures and bridles and weight load distributions and safe work method statements and rescue plans and all of those sorts of things. It's designed, once again, like the ETCP and NCP, where it's not designed to teach somebody from scratch. It's designed to assess somebody's capabilities with 3 to 5 years plus experience in the industry. But the back end of that is that there is now about 10 short courses that you can do to help you build your skills to that level. Right.
And going back to your reference to Pink and Taylor Swift, were they bringing their own riggers, and was there contention on what people could and couldn't do? But in Australia, like, how does that get worked out with international tours?
So they were bringing their own riggers, but not to replace us, but just to work alongside us. And the government inspectors in the first instance didn't understand our skill levels, didn't understand the difference between entertainment rigging and construction site rigging, and didn't understand the relationship between the international technicians and the local technicians. So we've worked on hundreds of international shows where the production brings a number of technicians with them. We supplement their skills with our own, and it's a side-by-side relationship. And realistically, if you're working on something like Taylor Swift or Pink or Ed Sheeran was one of the other ones where there was no way known the Australian crew could ever be expected to stand it up on their own. But it came down to, okay, they haven't actually got any of the skills and licenses in Australia that the government wanted to see. As it turned out, about 2 days later, after numerous sit-down meetings with the government, realised that they actually had parallel qualifications and skills that we could map across and do what they call intermediate gap training, which allowed us to keep going. But it was a fairly tense 6 to 8 hours where they said, no, everything stop. Nobody's allowed to work. All the internationals have to stay on the ground with a pair of binoculars and they can point and talk over a two-way radio. And it's like, nah, that's not really going to work.
Night one of Taylor Swift is not going to happen in that way.
Yeah, it got pretty tense for a while. And as you can imagine, the promoters starting to have conversations at high level with government about, okay, well, if we need to do this, then we better start looking at cancelling shows. And it all worked out. It all worked out in the end, and the government inspectors actually came on board quite a lot better. But just as an example, the first time they walked onto the arena, we were in the middle of the first part of the production build after Stageco had built the structure, and they looked up and there were two guys standing on top of a tower putting in some pyro emplacements for flame jets, and they didn't understand that we had harnesses and fall arrests and work method statements and rescue plans and material data sheets for all of the flammable materials and all of this sort of thing. And they just saw two people standing on a tower of 25 metres in the air, basically pulling up a box. They got very angry, and then we got very upset, and then all of a sudden cooler heads prevailed and we started rolling out the reams of paperwork that obviously go along with an international production.
Yeah, amazing. And so I guess the other question is, like, who prepares all that paperwork as an international entity is coming in? Like, that must take a bit of time to pull it all together, because you'd have to know what is coming in, how they're putting it together, et cetera, correct?
Yeah. So it starts with the engineering. Stageco on that particular production and Tate were the automation supplier on that production. Then you had the lighting supplier from overseas. You had the pyrotechnics supplier, the sound supplier, all came in from overseas. They'd all supplied work method statements or safety analysis, risk assessments, etc. The structural side of it, they'd supplied international certified engineering documentation. So in Australia, that documentation then has to be checked by a local engineer and given a certification that it complies with the Australian standards and the Australian provisions for things like wind load, rain load, snow load, ground bearing pressures, all of that sort of thing.
Right.
So there's a very good company in Australia called Vandermeers who undertake a lot of that sort of work, as well as working with local high-end suppliers of those sorts of structures. One of the interesting things with the Australian standards is that the wind load and rain loads are quite high compared to what they are elsewhere in the world. And in a lot of situations, we have to prepare what's known as an alternative method statement, which means that at a certain wind load, we will shut down the event and send everybody home rather than trying to engineer something to a ridiculous amount of wind. The Australian standard for wind load is 142 kilometres an hour. So anything less than, if your structure won't stand up at 142 kilometres an hour of wind, you have to have some other wind management in place.
Right.
Then all of the safety documentation then gets reviewed by myself and other safety people. We all tend to bite off different parts of the elephant, and, you know, I'll deal with rigging and height safety, and one of the other guys will deal with electrical safety or chemical management, something like that. Put it all together, and it sits in a cloud file so we can all review it. But one of the things that is very hard for the occupational health and safety government people is when they ask to see our safety documentation, they can either have a 10-minute conversation with myself and the safety officer and a couple of others, or we can present them with about 17,000 pages of...
You want to read that?
Well, you know, the engineering analysis for the structure, the moving elements of the stage, and then the Australian analysis is about 1,400 pages to start with.
Mm. And I guess how often is it that somebody coming from overseas, from whatever project, you are requesting amendments to their structures or their methods, etc.? Is that something that happens often, or not?
Very rarely from, and this sounds terrible, very rarely from outside of Asia. we've had some issues with structures that have come in from Asia where we've had to, either the structure has had to be amended or the structure just physically wasn't able to be built in Australia and we had to come up with another plan. Things coming in from Europe and America, very rarely do we have to amend the structure itself physically, but quite often we have to amend the wind management plan or the evacuation plan or something like that.
Right.
Once again, work methods, most of the European and American standards for height safety and working at heights and machine operation are all aligned. So very rarely do we have to amend those. Some of the ones that come in from some of the shows in Asia, we need to do some fairly serious work with how we, especially rescue plans. Rescue plans don't seem to be, and contingency plans don't seem to be a thing in Asia at the moment, but it's something that we're working quite hard to fix.
So interesting.
I've just recently had a conversation with a couple of people in Macau and another group in Hong Kong about rescue plans. I know you've worked on shows where rescue plans are a big thing, and contingency plans and show stops and that sort of thing are a very large part of the pre-planning of your shows. The same thing with our some of the shows that are touring through Australia from Asia at the moment. Those sorts of show stops and contingencies are just something you're not even allowed to mention in a meeting. So, it's an interesting cultural exchange when that comes along.
Yeah, I think working in this region, I can certainly say that it's still a developing market in the sense of the 360 way that you would approach a project, right? So the focus is getting something up, not necessarily all of the holistic paperwork and certifications and safety procedures that you might need to do it. So it's a slow burn, but they're catching up. And often with, a lot of hard work and pushing, as you probably have done in Australia, is you keep putting that at the forefront. And when there are, obviously, I think when incidents in this region, there's that mirror concert accident in Hong Kong just after the pandemic, that was a big wake up call for this region. That that things, and the government came in and obviously was like, okay, this needs to be looked at. So unfortunately, incidents are not good, but sometimes the situation then highlights the weaknesses in the processes and the protocols.
One of the strange parallels that I have at the moment is, as an automation person and as a rigger, I also become de facto communications consultant on a lot of the jobs. Some of the systems that are running around these days, ClearCom and Bolero and those sorts of things, with the ability to have multiple channels on one belt pack. When you're dealing with a production where most of the creatives don't actually speak English, and you're running through interpreters and you've got three channels where one's their communications, one's our communication, and the third one is the interpreter. I look back to when I first started, where if you had two channels on a wired comm system, you were doing really well. Now you've got some of the amazing systems, where 150 channels is not unusual for some of the big productions like the Olympics. But a subject I know is very dear to your heart, show stops. Some of those conversations we had two shows that toured Australia recently where we actually had a stand-up argument with the production about how we were going to do a show stop and at what point we were going to determine a show stop, and we were told as the automation operators we didn't have the right to stop the show. So that became a very short but direct conversation with the creatives. It all worked out well, but yeah.
I won't ask the details on that because you're probably not privy to share those details, but very interesting. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, it's a big door to open, but what advice would you give to those who are interested in getting into rigging and automation, and what's the fundamental training do people need to get started, and then what sort of projects should they look for to enter the industry?
The first thing I think needs to be said is, if you find a rigger that doesn't want to tell you how or why something works, I'd find another rigger. There seems to be a bit of an interesting situation in rigging around the world at the moment. There's two very distinct camps. There's riggers who will talk to you and try and explain rigging to you no matter who you are. Obviously, time sensitive. You know, in the middle of a 45 hoist move is probably not the time to discuss how the motor controller works. But if you ask a rigger a basic question at an opportune time, if that person says, I'm a rigger and you're not, and that's the end of the conversation, I would definitely move on and find yourself a better rigging supplier. Even with Australian licensing and that sort of thing, we give everybody a chance. There's a lot of things you can do in rigging in Australia and certainly elsewhere in the world where you don't have to have a certification. And in fact, the whole thing about certification is testing and qualifying your skill level at a certain point, not going and doing a university course and then coming out and saying you're an arena rigger or an event rigger. If you're interested in how things stay in the air, how much things weigh and how to do things safely, then any rigging company should give you a basic go-to, sure, come and do half a dozen jobs with us. One of the other things, making up bridles and watching how the ground works on a big arena show, you can learn an awful lot just by keeping your eyes and ears open and helping along the way. If it's something you then decide that you want to go and learn more about, ask more questions, ask for an entry-level job, and most people will give it to you. One of the other things that I say to everybody that asks me about starting in rigging is don't go and spend a lot of money straight up. Like I don't know I got a rough idea what it's like elsewhere in the world, but in Australia, it's a $5,000 exercise to get yourself into a roof. By the time you buy harnesses, rope, do some basic training, plus the lost revenue time of not being able to work because you're going to all these courses, it's a rough numbers, about $5,000. You can learn a lot on the ground. We'll pay you, or the other rigging companies will pay you to learn after 2 or 3 months. If you decide that's something you want to keep going on to, then do your courses one bit at a time. Most of the rigging companies will help you out with some gear, obviously PPE like harnesses, lanyards and things you're going to need to go and buy. But yeah, that's a good place to start. The other thing is, and this is something that's quite interesting in the industry these days, everybody is a teacher and everybody is a student. The day that I give up learning, or the day that I think I've got nothing else to learn about this industry, then I'm probably going to give up because I've gone stupid. I see people on jobs at the moment who are teaching other people the basic skills like how to push a road case, how to lift a road case, how to bolt truss. That is still teaching and that is still learning. You don't have to go to school for 2 years to learn these basic skills. The other thing, coming back to the conversation we had before about if a rigger can't explain why they do something to you, then they probably don't actually know it. I find that teaching people is a really good way to keep my skills fresh, because if I sometimes find that I don't actually understand how to best teach you how to do something, and that makes me think about why I'm doing something a certain way. If I can articulate how I do that and I can teach somebody else, then it means I must know it reasonably well.
That's a good
Once again,
baseline.
not just for experienced riggers, somebody that's been pushing boxes for 3 months can still be a teacher.
Absolutely. And I love that. That's quite, I think, an Australian mentality, is to get on the ground and start learning with the people around you, right? Rather than taking all the courses and maybe going to university. And it's also that network of getting on the ground and getting into that work means that you're building up a reputation in the industry and connections, so that makes it opportunities for work then can open up for you in that sense.
We also have we have an Australian saying here: the guy who's first on your next job is the guy that's currently putting empty water bottles in the bin.
Yeah.
The person that doesn't have a job, so they're cleaning up around the place or rolling cables or asking somebody else if they need a hand, that's the person that you're going to be thinking of to be first on your crew for the next job.
Yeah.
The people that stand back, and there are those around. There's people that, I know I only do lighting. No, I only climb. I don't do bridles. I don't do bottom points. I don't push cases. Yeah, they're probably really good at climbing, but they may not be on your next team.
Yeah. Can you tell us about the craziest thing that you've been asked to do in the industry? Can you name something? So Showtech is entertainment, rigging, automation, staging, technical and uncommon services. So we're the people that
quite often the production rings up and says, I've got this idea. We just recently did a television show in Malaysia where we were building scaffold underwater, working with a 140-ton crane mounted on a barge, lowering scaffold and ballast blocks and stuff into the water while we were assembling stuff together. So that's one of the jobs. Pretty crazy. Opening of the Commonwealth Games, we hung an automation system from the 6 light towers at the MCG. And the opening of the show, we actually landed a 1.7 ton tram in the middle of the arena, and that was the first part of the show, which I myself and another guy suddenly popped up out of the middle of the stage and positioned the tram as it landed because it had to line up with things on stage. So if you ever watch back to the video, you'll see the tram flying in with its wings flapping, and then all of a sudden 2 little grey bodies pop up and pat it on the nose. So that was a bit of fun.
I'm gonna look that one up.
Rugby World Cup 2003, we did a fantastic thing, which was the impossible kick. So for those rugby fans, it was a place kick from the other end of the stadium by a 12-year-old kid. And when we were first testing it, I was the person that was stopping the ball.
Okay.
Which, if you've ever stood in front of a cannon, was probably pretty... we fired it the first time and we broke 23 seats in the seating bowl, and then we decided we needed to try and stop it bouncing off the field and hitting the seats. So, yeah, that was me and another guy with some crash pads. That's a bit of fun. I don't know. We keep getting asked to do strange things.
Mm.
The opening of the Parisian in Macau, we built an entire theatre under the Eiffel Tower at the Parisian in Macau, and then we flew in a hot air balloon on an automation system, which we had to inflate after the audience walked in and then deflate and hide again before they walked out.
I remember the visuals of that. I wasn't there, but I remember the visuals of that opening.
Yeah, that was a flying system that we actually rigged from the Eiffel Tower back to behind the seating stand. It was amazing. That was a crazy show.
Yeah.
As you know, in Macau, the weather's never quite as friendly as you'd like it to be, especially if you're doing shows.
That's it. Very unpredictable. This is probably a very difficult question for you to answer, but is there a gig that you've been most proud of?
Oh, I think lots of them. Opening ceremony of Commonwealth Games, definitely one of them. Opening ceremony for the Athens Olympics, definitely one of them. Working with the starts of NICA, which is the National Institute for Circus Arts, like being part of that project for the first, and I'm still part of it, but nowhere near as involved as I used to be. Touring the world with Circus Oz, doing some of the crazy way out things that we did there. World Expo 88, definitely. That was, so World Expo 88, we did 186 days straight. So 6 months of shows. We did somewhere around 7,000 shows over that 6 months across six venues. We had an aquacade, high dive, towers and all that sort of stuff. We had an amphitheatre that did everything from circus events to marching bands to a wood chop. Wood chopping in Australia is a bit of a sport. It happens at all of the agricultural shows, which is like the American state fairs. We had some of the biggest names in the world on the river stage, and we did 2 parades every day that went through the site. So that was pretty hectic. It was one of the things where you either worked at if you were a technician in Australia, you either worked at Expo or you toured through there. So I still had a lot of friends that I met at Expo. I think maintaining a company for as many years as we have is something to be pretty proud of. Buying half a dozen chain blocks and doing shows out of your bedroom and, having a desk in the middle of your living room to now having 16 full-time staff, a warehouse full of fairly high-end products in the rigging world, that sort of thing. Being involved in iCopper was definitely something I'm very proud of. For those people who've never read iCopper, the Code of Practice for Entertainment Rigging, jump onto the Plaza or Esther website and download a copy and have a read. It's not designed to be a how-to manual. It's designed to be have you thought of this conversation style? And what we did so it's available in a couple of different languages now, which has turned out to be really helpful because the translation actually has the English version and the whatever the other language is side by side. So you can actually have the conversation and compare the two translations and talk about the concept that's being discussed. I've done some pretty stupid things. I was involved in a Circus Oz show many years ago in Israel, where we had half the tent full of Israelis and half the tent full of Palestinians, and they all brought their guns. That was an interesting situation.
Oh my goodness.
We did the Delhi Commonwealth Games. We were working for an Australian pyrotechnics team over there, delivering all the pyrotechnics. Got to know the snipers in the catwalk very well. Luckily, they spoke English because, they were a fun bunch of people. But when we first showed up the first day and went, hang on, what are you guys doing up here? And they were like, we're up here because we're part of the military. What are you doing up here? That was an interesting 5 minutes of conversation. Cruise ships is definitely one of those things. I've done a number of dry docks. They are wild.
Yeah.
Cruise ships are, I know people think of cruise ships as just like another theme park, but they are another world. If you're a young technician and you ever want to get like 10 years experience in about 3 months, go and work on a cruise ship. It's relentless, but it's also, you learn so much. And we've been doing cruise ship work for about 15 years now. Fantastic bunch of people that work on there because there is no escape. You either figure it out or you don't do a show.
That's right. The people that I've ever hired from cruise ships have been some of the most resilient hires I've ever had, for sure.
Yeah. As I said, I'm just really lucky to have been able to do what I'm doing. And that being said, one of the things that I wish I'd known much earlier is that the human body's not as good as you think it is when you're 23. I've had 2 shoulder rebuilds. I've had tendon reconstruction. I've had 2 knees done, and I've had an ankle rebuild and tendon reconstruction on an ankle. So, I'm the guy now who is telling the 22-year-old to stop jumping off the front of the stage because your knees and ankles won't take it, because I'm the person that found out the hard way. So, hitting pins in with your hand will lead you to bad hands.
That's it.
All those things that we're trying to teach the young kids these days because we learnt the hard way when we were young.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-care on that situation.
Self-care.
Yeah. One of the final questions I'd like to ask, because I think you've sort of talked about the things that you like about your job and the industry. If you could change one thing about your job or the industry, what would that be?
Ooh, bit controversial, especially with some of the things that are happening around the world at the moment. A bit more understanding of each other's jobs and responsibilities, but also the challenges that other departments are having. The industry seems to be very self-focused at the moment. Lighting designers are more important than anybody else. Stage managers are more important than anybody else. And that's a big generalization. There's very small specifics, but it's like car accidents. You only remember the bad ones and you don't remember all the thousands of good drivers on the road. I think everybody just needs to stop and take a breath. Definitely, I'm frustrated, and I know lots of people are frustrated with all of the big companies that are talking about resilience and self-care and mental health and all of these sorts of things, and then program 22-hour days, finishing at 4 a.m. and having a 6:30 lobby call because you've got to be on a flight the next morning to meet the truck in the next city. You can't. I'm sorry, but you can't have it both ways. You're either going to be standing behind all these things and you program accordingly, and yes, that unfortunately costs money, or you're not committed to it, in which case stop talking about it.
Yeah. Wow.
There are a lot of people who are in Australia. We now have mental health first aid officers on a lot of our bigger productions. So not only do we have medics on site, we actually have mental health first aid officers on site. And those guys have been invaluable, being able to walk up to somebody who's just about to rip the head off another crew member and tap them on the shoulder and go, hey, let's go and have a chat in the car park for 10 minutes. Or, there's a room over there. Go and chill out for 2 minutes and come back with a better attitude. And those people have never been savaged. if you get the tap on the shoulder by one of those guys, you go, "Oh, okay, somebody's noticed something and I should probably go for a walk, have a breath and have a drink of water."
I love that.
But yeah,
I love that that's there.
that's the one thing. That's the one thing I'd really like to change, is that people who talk about mental health and people who talk about looking after yourself and each other actually mean it, not just putting it on a PR release.
Yeah, amazing. Look, Tiny, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. And it was good to spend an hour, 40 minutes with you. Thank you for joining the StageLync podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Anna. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for listening to the StageLync podcast. StageLync is an online platform that gives you access and connection to the live performing arts. As a guest, you can read about live performing arts from across the globe and gain insights from performers and artists on stage and all the amazing people who work behind the curtain. If you are an industry professional, StageLync Pro offers jobs, networks, and career support tools, and you can build your own professional profile on the site. As a StageLync podcast listener, you are eligible for 20% off your StageLync Pro membership. Visit us at stagelync.com and when joining, use the code SLPodcast. StageLync, that's StagelYnc.com.